Before we go into policy itself, I'm going to set the scene. What I'm going to do is take a funnel approach. So start at the top with more broadly the prevalence of domestic and family violence in community, then stepping down into the experience of workers of domestic and family violence, and then we're going to step down even further into community services workplaces. So we'll jump onto the next slide there. Thanks, Stacey. Thank you. So in order to do that, we need to find a shared definition of what domestic and family violence is. So different employees are going to have different understandings of what domestic and family violence is, and it's really important that there's a shared understanding across staff, because when we have this shared understanding, that helps them recognise domestic and family violence, both potentially in the experiences of colleagues, but also potentially in their own experiences as well. So I'll just read that definition for you. So domestic and family violence is when one person behaves towards another person in a way that is physically or sexually abusive, emotionally or physically abusive, economically abusive, threatening, and or coercive. It's when the behaviour of one person in any way or controls or dominates another person who's in a relevant relationship, or causes that other person to fear for their safety or the well-being of someone else. So that's been adapted from Section 8 of the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act. And that's quite an extensive section which really highlights a whole range of behaviours that can come under the umbrella of domestic and family violence. And it is worth scrolling through. So in the policy template that we've provided, we include that definition taken directly from the Act, and we also include the definition of domestic and family violence that's included in the Fair Work Act as well. So one of the reasons we have two definitions there is because there isn't actually one standard definition of domestic and family violence. It differs across organisations, it differs across states and territories, it differs between countries, and that can really add to confusion around what this thing actually is. We find the terminology can also trip people up. So people can think violence is just a physical thing, but domestic and family violence incorporates a whole range of violence and abuses, and that can include things like verbal abuse, isolation, coercive control, and economic abuse. The other thing we do really want to highlight is that domestic and family violence can include child abuse and elder abuse. And as well as abuse within extended family and kinship networks. And it might also include violence by a child or adolescent towards a parent. So what that means is it's not just intimate partner violence, which is one of the, I guess, messages that can be put out there about domestic and family violence. You may also notice that I say domestic and family violence in full rather than DFV. And that's even though we have DFV work aware as kind of a more catchy phrase, but that's because using the initialisation, so just DFV, has the risk of reducing a really complex and sensitive issue to some meaningless letters. And we don't want to lose how complex and sensitive and important this issue is. So that's why I'll be saying that in full as we go. So as Stacey's flagged, there's going to be opportunities to ask questions throughout the presentation. So what I'll suggest is as I go through these sections, make some notes. And if I answer a question, tick it off. If that question is still there to be answered, when you see the question slide come up, that's when we'll have an opportunity to have a bit of Q&A. So we'll jump to the next slide. Thanks, Stacey. All right, so I'm going to say stats because statistics always trips me up. Stats really help us better understand who's impacted by domestic and family violence. And what I'm going to do is share some of those stats with you. Some of them you may be aware of and some of them you may not. And I'll also flag that some of these stats can be intense to hear. So be mindful of that within yourself as you hear that and take a break if you need to. You'll see on the slide I've popped two links up there and you will have copies of this presentation so you can access these. There's a really great resource there from ANRO's Accurate Use of Key Statistics, and then the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare also provides easily accessible statistics as well. So as I walk through these stats, I'd like you to keep in mind your workforce and also the broader community that you serve in the work that you do. So one key stat is that since the age of 15 years, approximately 1 in 4 women and 1 in 13 men have experienced at least one incident of violence by an intimate partner. So we recognise that domestic and family violence can be perpetrated by a person of any gender, and the victim survivor can be of any gender. And at the same time, we must acknowledge that the disproportionate impact of domestic and family violence is on women, who are almost 3 times more likely than men to have experienced violence by a partner since the age of 15 years. This one stat is, I guess, fairly well known with media coverage, and that's that on average, 1 woman dies every week in Australia as a result of domestic and family violence. A stat that's slightly less well known is that on average, 1 child dies every fortnight as a result of violence perpetrated by a parent or step parent. Now, if you listen to the language I'm using, you might pick up that the face of domestic and family violence is quite heterosexual and cisgender, but we know that domestic and family violence occurs within the LGBTQIA+ community. So domestic and family violence occurs within gay and lesbian relationships at similar levels as heterosexual relationships. And within the broader LGBTQIA+ communities, domestic and family violence often manifests itself as family violence against a family member. So you can imagine a young person whose parents aren't accepting of them, who perpetrate violence against them, may kick them out of home. That's an example of domestic and family violence. What's really great is there's some emerging community-led research about domestic and family violence within LGBTQIA+ communities. So watch this space because more and more information is becoming available here. Another important statistic is that women with disability experience higher rates of domestic and family violence than the general population, and that's usually perpetrated by a carer or someone known to them. First Nations women aged 15 years and over are 34 times more likely than non-First Nations women to be hospitalised as a result of domestic and family violence. And it is important to set that statistic in context and note that people who use violence against First Nations women can come from a variety of backgrounds. Another thing to think of, particularly for people who are living and working outside of metro southeast Queensland, is that women living outside of metro areas are more likely to experience domestic and family violence than people living in metro areas. So that's got implications for our workforces outside of those areas. So now we have an idea of the prevalence of domestic and family violence in the community, and we're going to narrow our focus to the workplace. Thanks, Stacey. So I've got some more stats for you. So if you're really into your stats, this part of the presentation is for you. Research is continuing to emerge about the prevalence of domestic and family violence amongst workers, and this is where we're up to so far. So we know that around 62% of women subjected to intimate partner violence are employed. So a lot of people experiencing domestic and family violence might be in our workplaces. We know that around 1 in 5 workers experiencing domestic and family violence report the violence continuing into the workplace, which means it doesn't stop at the front door, it carries on even when they're at work. And we had some, there was some research published in early 2021 that indicated that a woman faces a 35% increased risk of violence from a male partner when she earns more than him. And that can speak to those gendered drivers of domestic and family violence and those rigid gender roles. There's something that's really important for us when we consider recognising and responding to domestic and family violence in the workplace is around 45% of workers experiencing domestic and family violence disclose to a colleague. So that really highlights a whole of workforce approach being important for preventing, recognising and responding to domestic and family violence because it's often their colleague rather than a supervisor or a manager who they're disclosing to. So we need everybody in the workforce on board here, not just management. Now, the other thing to consider here is that where there are victim survivors of domestic and family violence, there are people who are using that violence against them. It's not some mythical being out there that we don't know about. So the people who use violence, there's a possibility that they might be employees in our organisations as well. So the example on this slide that I've given of the headline there is an example of an employee who's been using violence. He's been using it against his wife, who's in paid employment, so as a worker. And the person using violence abused his wife through her colleagues. So the colleagues were also drawn into this situation as well. So that shows, just in this one example, which is from the end of last year, so quite recent, how domestic and family violence can impact the workplace in multiple ways. So what we've found is that Canada is leading the way in researching use of domestic and family violence by employees. A 2012 Canadian study, so a little while ago now, found that around 35% or a third or so of male offenders enrolled in a men's behaviour change program used workplace resources to perpetrate the violence. So that included use of work phones, internet and vehicles. And you can imagine if there isn't a policy around what misuse of resources might mean, there's a gap there within organisational policies. Then we have a more recent Canadian study, which found that from 2017, which again found around a third, so 34% of men who disclosed using violence reported so during work hours. So this is something that is being actively perpetrated on work time using work resources. That makes it very much a workplace issue. Now, as I'm walking through here, you may notice in my language that I'll often talk about the person using violence or the employee who uses or may use violence, rather than saying the perpetrator. And that's because it's part of a growing conversation around how violence is a choice. And people who are using violence are choosing to use violence. And when we say person using violence, what we're saying is that's not okay. And we want and expect you to make better choices. So overall, what that means is that domestic and family violence is being experienced and it's being used during work hours, and it follows people to work from home. Just check. Yep, thanks, Stacey. So this next slide, the heading there is from March this year, and it highlights how domestic and family violence might show up in the workplace. In this case, a young woman was working for a community service, which was not-for-profit aged care, and she was abducted from the workplace car park by a man allegedly known to her. So that's an example of how man's violence against a woman came into a workplace within our sector. So DFV Work Aware training provides more information about recognising domestic and family violence in the workplace. So I'll only provide a brief overview here, but you're certainly welcome to get in touch if you'd like to arrange free training for your workplace. So some examples of how domestic and family violence can come into the workplace include threats to a person or a person's co-workers in the workplace, harassment or assaults on the person or co-workers at their workplace. And that could be in person, it could be through phone calls and emails. I remember once at a workplace, we got spam faxes. So I imagine that would be rare, but if there's a way of contacting a workplace, someone who's stalking or harassing someone may be using that. And in the most extreme cases, we may see domestic and family violence related homicide in the workplace. Now, there are some signs that an employee may be experiencing domestic and family violence. Lateness or absenteeism is often a key sign, and that could be because the person has injuries that mean they don't feel able or aren't able to attend work, or they may actually be being prevented from attending work by the person who's using violence as a means of controlling them. There may be observable impacts on their physical health. So they may have injuries, for example, or might be trying to hide them. There may be observable impacts on their mental well-being. So they may seem quite stressed. There may be some mental health concerns emerging. They might appear teary or fearful. And there might be some excuses offered for these things that just aren't quite adding up. The other thing you may notice is poorer or reduced performance, and that might result from being quite distracted or being quite fatigued and having difficulty concentrating. And you can imagine if someone's performance is impacted, they might then be subjected to performance management. And without having that broader understanding of, well, hey, let's check out what's actually happening for this person and what supports we can put in place, it might mean that someone experiencing domestic and family violence is then experiencing performance management too without additional support in place. And that's what we're trying to we don't want that to be happening, and this is where developing really good policy will help us provide really supportive environments for our colleagues and our employees. Now, signs for an employee who may be using violence can actually be quite similar. So, for example, they might be quite distracted because they're actually using their phone or their computer to monitor or harass the person that they're abusing. However, we also know that people who use violence can be very good at impression management, so it can be quite hard to pick up. Some signs that may come through, they may be the person who bullies in the workplace, and the way they treat others in the workplace may be a symptom of how they treat people outside of the workplace. They can be very good at convincing both themselves and other people that they're not responsible for the abuse. For example, talking about, you know, the hysterical woman, the crazy girlfriend, in inverted commas. That's a very stigmatizing and discriminating term that can be used to try and discredit others. They may invite others to collude with their beliefs. So they might invite colleagues to share in derogatory jokes, or they might share explicit photos for a bit of a laugh. They might be putting people down like an elderly parent. You know, all of those things might be indicators that there's something going on. And then the clearest one, but the most unlikely one, unfortunately, is they may actually disclose that they are using violence or that there is a domestic violence order in place. And that's the clearest indicator that something's going on. It's important to hold this in context too, though, because signs by themselves aren't conclusive indicators that someone is either experiencing or using domestic and family violence. And that's because people live their own complex and rich lives. But when there are signs like that being observed in a person in the workplace, that's a sign in itself that something might be amiss, and that it may be time to be checking in with that colleague. How are things going for you, and what support might you be needing?